It's February of 1990 in Mumbai. This Indian Airlines flight has flown in from Goa the previous night. It will now fly as IC605 to Bangalore. No issues from the previous flight have been reported. On board the flight are 139 passengers. The pilot in command is Captain Satish, fairly experienced with more than 10,000 hours of flying. Alongside him is the second operating pilot, Captain Cyril. He has 9,300 hours of flying. However, only 68 of these are on this aircraft type. Captain Cyril will be the pilot flying today, as he is undertaking a route check supervision under Captain Satish. This route check is being used to assess Captain Cyril's ability to act as the captain on the A320. The flight is set to depart at 11 AM on that day. However, there has been a delay and the aircraft departs just 2 minutes before noon. The entire sequence of the flight, from the pushback, starting of the engines, taxiing to the runway, and then taking off, all the way to cruise, has been uneventful. After taking off from Mumbai, IC605 flies at 33,000 feet and has no reported issues during the cruise so far. Around 30 minutes after departure, at 12:25, IC605 contacts Bangalore's ATC and gets confirmation that the weather at Bangalore is good and overall conditions are clear. The ATC then assigns them runway 09 for landing. 20 minutes later, IC605 is authorized by the ATC to descend down to 11,000 feet. During this descent, the aircraft is slightly higher than usual, and to allow for a faster descent, the speed brakes are also used. At 12:58, the captain then conducts an approach checklist to ensure that the aircraft is ready for approach into Bangalore. They have descended down to 8,500 feet and are about 5 to 10 minutes away from landing. At this point, the pilots cross-check their approach speed of 132 knots. This is the minimum speed that the pilots will target to maintain when landing. With the aircraft now ready for its final approach, and just a few minutes away from landing, the flaps are extended and the landing gear is also deployed. At 1 PM, IC605 is just 7 miles from runway 09, and the pilots have visual sighting. Hence, they disconnect the autopilot. All this while, the aircraft has been descending using a mode on the Airbus A320 called the vertical speed mode. In this vertical speed mode, the pilots select a target altitude and a target rate of climb or descent, which the airplane then maintains. Take for instance in this case, if you're descending down from 10,000 feet to 4,000 feet, and you set a rate of 1,000 feet of minute for your descent, the aircraft then maintains that and ensures that the speed is kept constant. It does that by modulating the engine power and maintaining the requested rate of climb or descent. However, there is also another mode on the Airbus called the open mode. In this, there is open climb and an open descent. When this mode is selected, it's the engine thrust that is fixed at either climbing power or idle power. The pilots must then adjust the pitch of the airplane to control the climb or the descent rate, and also the airspeed. An easy way to remember this is that in vertical speed mode, the aircraft maintains a constant speed, and in open mode, the aircraft maintains a constant engine thrust. A short while later, whilst being only a couple of minutes away from landing, there seems to have been an action that resulted in the vertical speed mode changing to the idle open descent mode. It is also crucial to note that this change is only possible if a lower altitude is selected. There are 3 theories that have been put forward as to why this change could have happened. The first one is the wrong button theory. In this, it's assumed that the pilots made a mistake when they were changing the descent rate from 1,000 feet per minute to 700 feet per minute. They mistook the altitude knob, which sits very close to the vertical speed selection knob, and selected 700 feet of altitude and not the 700 feet per minute of descent rate. As this would have been a lower altitude than what they were flying at, the aircraft switched into idle open mode. However, data that was taken from the flight recorder showed that the engine pressure ratio temporarily increased. The engine power would usually increase if the aircraft was climbing and not descending had they chosen a lower altitude. Hence, this theory can be ruled out. The second theory states that there was a malfunction of the internal flight computer. This could have happened due to a serious incorrect signal input between the system. The reset of the FCU meant that the altitude would have auto-resetted to 100 feet. This again would mean a lower altitude than the current altitude that they were flying at, and hence the mode would have changed to an open mode. However, Airbus forwarded a reply on the 19th of September 1990 stating the following: "There has never been a report of any malfunctions of the FCU altitude resetting. There are two FCU channels, and in the case that one fails, the other can take over and function properly. Hence, this theory is very unlikely and can also be ruled out. The most probable theory is the third, an altitude mistake." Most pilots tend to put an altitude setting in the case that they need to go around. Airbus has suggested that the pilot first selected a higher altitude in the case of a missed approach and put in 6,000 feet. He realized that this was not the correct time for such a selection, as changing the altitude would cause the aircraft to change its modes. Immediately, the pilot reversed the altitude knob to a lower altitude through a wrist flick. This would have triggered the mode to change to an open idle descent. To support this theory, Airbus also provided evidence of the slight increase in the engine pressure ratio. This is due to the higher set altitude momentarily of 6,000 feet, as gaining altitude would need more power. Also, flight voice recorders were analyzed and provided evidence that during this time, the pilot was heard saying,
"Missed approach altitude."
This indicates that his intention was to set a higher altitude in the case of a go-around. It appears that after selecting the lower altitude, the pilot did not scan the flight parameters to see the result of his selection. At this point, the speed of the aircraft is slowly starting to drop. The aircraft's nose pitch is also increasing to prevent it from descending too quick. Captain Satish is heard saying, "You're descending in idle open, huh?" Clearly in confusion. As this is going on, the flight directors on the Airbus A320 are also working. A flight director is a guidance aid that is overlaid on the display, and this shows the pilot what pitch and bank angles to maintain. Captain Satish is aware that if the flight directors are switched off, the mode automatically changes back to the vertical speed mode. Knowing this, he asks Captain Cyril to turn the flight directors off. On the Airbus A320, there are two flight director switches, one for each pilot. However, it seems that Captain Cyril only switches off his own switch, and the second switch that is in front of Captain Satish never gets switched off. To this, Captain Satish says, "You did not switch off mine." It seems that at this point, there was confusion and the first hint of panic creeping in. There is a possibility that Captain Cyril may have pressed on both the switches to turn off the flight directors, but not sufficient pressure was applied, and hence the second flight director in front of Captain Satish remains switched on. A few seconds later, the speed has now dropped down to 121 knots. As the idle mode is still activated, and nothing has been done to rectify to switch it back to a vertical speed mode. Surprisingly, neither of the pilots call out the speed being too low, and at this stage, there is very less time remaining to save this aircraft. 1 second later, the call out for 200 feet is heard.
200.
Hearing this call out, Captain Satish is in shock that the aircraft has still not changed its mode back to the vertical speed mode. Just after the call out for 200 feet, Captain Cyril realizes that they are about to crash. Captain Satish is pulling back on the side stick to try and raise the nose up aggressively, as he is aware of their proximity to the ground below. This action triggers a safety protection that Airbus has, called Alpha Floor. If the side stick is pulled back more than 14 degrees, the flight computer automatically puts the aircraft's engine in a full power mode. This ideally should help the aircraft get out of dangerously low speed situations. However, the sequence of the pilot pulling back the side stick, the system activating in the FCU, and then the engines fully powering up takes about 8 seconds. And as the engines start to power up, the aircraft is already sinking rapidly and is only at 106 knots of speed, just 110 feet above the approaching golf course that lies ahead of it. Unfortunately, they just do not have the 8 seconds needed to get the engines to full power, and the aircraft has become unrecoverable at this point. Just 2 seconds later, The aircraft contacts the ground in a golf course that lies in the path of the runway. The first impact does not cause any damage as the aircraft bounces on its rear landing gear. The aircraft then rolls for 80 feet on its main wheels, then goes back in the air and then hops for another 230 feet, hitting a few trees in its path. The aircraft then hits the ground again on all of its wheels, this time digging deep into the golf course's grass. The aircraft then collides with an embankment, which forms the boundary of the golf course and the airport. This impact causes the engines to get detached from the wing. The landing gears are also broken as a result. At the time the aircraft has stopped, it's only 150 feet away from the boundary wall of the airport. The wreckage of this aircraft is scattered. Engine 1 and 2, which separated, fall on the road ahead. The landing gear structure has also been destroyed. The wings, though, remain attached to the fuselage. The fuel tanks in the aircraft still hold 3,500 kilograms of fuel. This leaks through the wing, which has ruptured and starts a fire. This fire starts in the forward fuselage and then later spreads towards the rear. The impact and the crash of this aircraft does not cause any deaths. However, it's the rapidly spreading fire that leads to the casualties in this incident. Following this, an investigation is then launched and a court proceeding was conducted. The court's official report contains 600 pages of information, which I've condensed down into this video.